Hello everybody, welcome to jurycentral.com online classes for law exams. So today I will be discussing with you the subjective questions of ILI LLM entrance examination of the year 2020. So I have already discussed with you the objective questions of ILI CAT 2020. I'll share the link in the description box below. So today I will be dealing with you a total number of 4 subjective questions, and I would be discussing with you in detail the solution of every subjective questions. And let me tell you, each questions carry 10 marks. So let us start. So the first is, with reference to relevant cases, discuss constitutionality of decriminalization of homosexuality. So first we'll start with introduction. So let us just keep it in mind that whenever you are writing any subjective type questions, then try to start your solution with the introduction and end with a valid conclusion. On September 6, 2018, the Supreme Court of India in Navtej Singh Johar and others versus Union of India, in short the Navtej Johar case, struck down parts of Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code 1860, which is Section 377, which criminalized sexual intercourse against the order of nature. The Supreme Court effectively allowed sexual intercourse between consenting adult members of the lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender community. So, the question is actually in reference to a decision given by the Supreme Court on September 6, 2018 in the case of Navtej Singh Johar versus Union of India, in which the Supreme Court has partially struck down Section 377. Historical background. So let us see. Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code came into force more than a century and a half ago in 1869, when India was still being ruled by the British. Although India gained independence from Britain in 1947, its criminal code continued to be based on the one that had been developed during the British. In 2001, a non-governmental organization called the Nas Foundation approached the Delhi High Court demanding that homosexuality be decriminalized. A landmark 2009 judgment from the Delhi High Court did justice, declaring Section 377 to be violative of fundamental rights guaranteed by the Constitution of India. So, before this Supreme Court decision, this law has already been struck down by Delhi High Court in the year 2001. Then, in 2013, the Supreme Court overruled the Delhi High Court decision, saying essentially that it was for Parliament to take a call on the matter rather than the courts. But the decision of the Delhi High Court was overruled by the Supreme Court in the year 2013 in the Suresh Kumar Kaushal's case. Then soon after, a curative petition saw the case being taken back to the Supreme Court, this time with a 5-judge constitution bench, which on Thursday gave its verdict in the case. What does the judgment say? Now let us understand in 4 different but concurring opinions. So first of all, this judgment has been delivered by a 5-judge constitution bench, and this judgment has been delivered in 4 concurring opinions. The Supreme Court said that Section 377, as far as the aspect of criminalizing consensual homosexual sex goes, runs contradictory to the Constitution. In consequence, the court has read down the provision and has declared all forms of consensual sex between competing adults to be legal. This consent of the court clarified should be free consent without any coercion. So, for Section 377 to be valid, it is necessary that the sexual intercourse shall be free but without any force or coercion. The concurring judgments. There were 4 separate concurring judgments which struck down Section 377 to the extent that it criminalized consensual sex intercourse between adults. The primary grounds under the Constitution were: first is right to equality under Article 14, right against discrimination under Article 15, right to freedom of speech and expression under Article 19, and fourth one, right to privacy under Article 21. So on these 4 grounds, this section has been partially struck down by the Supreme Court. So let us deal with each and every grounds one by one. Right to equality. The right to equality under Article 14 requires equal treatment of all citizens before law. While it allows for a distinction to be drawn between different categories of individuals, it also mandates that such a distinction must be based on intelligible differentia and must have a rational nexus with the object sought to be achieved. So this differentiation has to be based on intelligible differentia. The Supreme Court held that there was no intelligible differentia between people who supposedly engage in natural intercourse and those who engage in carnal intercourse against the order of nature. Then next come right against discrimination. Article 15 prevents the state from discriminating against any citizen only on the ground of sex, religion, race, caste or place of birth. This provision was previously interpreted to mean that discrimination which is not only on the ground mentioned above is permitted. In the Naftaj Zohar case, the Supreme Court moved away from this narrow view and held that any ground of discrimination, whether direct or indirect, which is founded on a particular understanding of the role of the sex, constitute discrimination under Article 14. That means although gay has not been defined or has not been given under Article 15 and for the grounds on which discrimination is prevented. So the Supreme Court said that no, even this community, this LGBT community also comes under Article 15 and they are not to be discriminated because of their particular sex. Constitutes discrimination under Article 15. This way, the Supreme Court expanded the prohibited grounds of discrimination under Article 15 to include sexual orientation, and therefore Section 377 was held to be discriminatory under Article 15. Then, right to freedom of speech and expression, and Article 19 allows for the freedom of speech and expression to all citizens. The Supreme Court noted that consensual carnal intercourse among adults in a private space doesn't in any way harm public decency or morality. Consequently, Section 377 doesn't qualify as a reasonable restriction on an individual's freedom of speech and expression. Then comes right to privacy. Article 21 provides for the protection of life and personal liberty as a fundamental right. Over the years, the Supreme Court has interpreted this right to include the right to live with dignity, the right to privacy and the right to autonomy. The Supreme Court found Section 377 to be in violation of these constitutional rights. So there are 4 constitutional rights upon which this section has been termed as unconstitutionally valid. Then comes the conclusion. This historic judgment finally, although belatedly, puts India in the list of almost 150 countries where homosexual activity is legal. The decriminalization of sexual intercourse between all consenting adults was an eagerly anticipated first step towards recognizing the rights of the LGBT community in India. It will be interesting to see if the legislature and courts go further in recognizing other civil rights, including allowing same-sex couples to marry and adopt children, and the right against discrimination, particularly for employment and housing. 46 countries have recognized same-sex marriage and 42 countries have given same-sex couples the right to adopt children. Further, almost 100 countries have recognized the importance of substantive equality and have sought to prevent discrimination against the LGBT community with respect to housing and employment. So, by this conclusion, the author wants to say that although we have decriminalized homosexual activity, but still there are other issues which needs to be addressed, like same-sex couple marriage and their right to adopt children and also their right to have housing and employment. So these issues also needs to be addressed along with this this provision. Then question number 2, critically discuss Dworkin's interpretative jurisprudence. So let us start with an introduction. So now we'll understand who was Ronald Dworkin. Ronald Miles Dworkin was an American philosopher, jurist and scholar of United States constitutional law. Dworkin had taught previously at Yale Law School and the University of Oxford, where he was a professor of jurisprudence, successor to renowned philosopher H.L.A. Hart. So this is a brief introduction about the philosopher called Ronald Dworkin. Then comes Dworkin and constructive interpretation. Dworkin set out his theory on constructive interpretation in Lost Empire. So Lost Empire is one of his famous books in which he has set his theory on constructive interpretation mainly as a reaction to positivist conception of law, in particular to the one of Hart. He was the successor of Hart, and he was also a strong opponent of the opinions of this philosopher called Hart, and he actually concentrated in his books as a reaction against the positivist conception of law. Lawsuits can raise three different issues, like issues of fact, issues of law, and issues of political morality and fidelity. The first category refers to what actually happened, the second to what the pertinent law is, and the third to what just outcome should be. According to positivists, there can be no theoretical disagreements about what the law is, because law is a matter of what legal institutions have decided in the past and what is written down in records. Unwritten or moral principles are not therefore part of law. So, and now he has something to say. I mean, Dworkin has a total different opinion against this theory of positivism. So let us see. If a disagreement appears to be of a theoretical nature, it is actually, according to positivist, disagreement about what the law should be. Dworkin doesn't agree with this and suggests that positivists suffer from semantic sting because they assume that every lawyer uses the same criteria to assess whether propositions of law are true or false. This, Dworkin insists, is not the case. He mentions a couple of actual hard cases where the disagreement between the judges clearly did concern the question of what the law actually was, and not whether the law should be followed. So, like positivist generally says, I mean, that is their viewpoint, that the disagreement regarding disagreement of the judges to any law is not about what the law was. It is actually what the law should be. A constructive interpretation is carried out to establish the meaning of a certain practice without indicating the intentions attached to the practice by its author. The practice in itself is central, and the interpreter has to take into account the history and shape of the practice to see which interpretations of the practice are impossible. The positivist doesn't believe what the law actually was. I mean, positivists are not at all concentrated about the historical significance of any law, but according to the constructive interpretation by Dworkin, it says the practice in itself is central, and the interpreter has to take into account the history and shape of the practice to see which interpretation of the practice are possible. The law as integrity, this is also one of the pivotal part of this constructive interpretation. A pivotal aspect of Dworkin's theory of constructive interpretation is his notion of law as integrity. The conception of law as integrity is an intrinsic political value that requires lawmakers to make laws morally coherent and judges to treat our present system of public standards as expressing and respecting a coherent set of principles. According to Dworkin, integrity is valuable and of itself because our intuition rejects legal practices that do not propagate integrity. Interpreting law as a coherent and normative unity is an important aspect of Dworkin's conception of law. Law as integrity is an ideal that judges have to keep in mind every time they decide on a hard case. So law of integrity is nothing but it's actually an ideal for the judges whenever they keep their mind on deciding any hard case. That means it actually helps in interpretation, in constructive interpretation of any law. As a consequence, every rule has to be interpreted in connection with other rules. And now we'll come to the conclusion. Dworkin developed his theory as a method of interpretation to be performed by a judge. So this method of interpretation actually, Ronald Dworkin suggests that it has to be performed by a judge, As a method of interpretation of any law, the idea of finding the best possible interpretation of a rule in the light of its underlying interest, goals, and principles, keeping in mind the idea of law as integrity, constitutes a workable research method. Then comes the next question, the question number 3, which is write an essay on privity of contract. So now we'll start with the introduction. The doctrine of privity of contract is a common law principle which implies that only parties to a contract are allowed to sue each other to enforce their rights and liabilities, and no stranger is allowed to confer obligations upon any person who is not a party to contract, even though the contract have been entered into for his benefit. So that's what the law of privity of contract suggests. So according to this, only the parties to the contract can sue each other, and no stranger, that means no third person can is allowed to sue the party, to sue upon a contract in which he is not a party. The rule of privity is basically based on the interest theory, which implies that the only person having an interest in the contract is entitled as per law to protect his right. Then illustration. So let us understand, if Ramesh makes a promise to deliver goods to Arun, then in this case, if Ramesh breaches the contract, then only Arun has a right to prosecute him and no other person can prosecute him, because these two persons are actually in agreement. Then English law versus Indian law. Let us understand the difference. As a general rule, both Indian and English law are similar to each other, that only parties to contract can sue each other. In a leading case of Tweedle versus Atkinson, it was held that the plaintiff cannot sue as he was both a stranger to the contract as well as stranger to consideration. This concept of privity of contract was again analyzed in the case of Dunlop Pneumatic Tire Company Limited versus Selfridge and Company Limited. So remember these two cases, Tweedle versus Atkinson and Dunlop Pneumatic Tire Company Limited versus Selfridge and Company Limited. These two cases are actually have set the rules of privity of contract. In the Indian context also, this concept of privity of contract is similar. The only difference being that in India, a person who is a stranger to consideration can sue, whereas in England he cannot. So there is actually an exception. In English law, a stranger to consideration cannot sue, but in India, even a stranger to consideration can sue. Then essentials of privity of contract. What are the essentials? So there are actually 4 essentials. A contract has been entered into between two parties. Parties must be competent and there should be a valid consideration. Then there has been a breach of contract by one party. And 4th, only parties to contract can sue each other. So remember these 4 points. Now exceptions to doctrine of privity of contract, like even the doctrine of privity suggests that a stranger cannot sue for a contract, but there are also exceptions provided under Indian law. As a general rule, only parties to contract are entitled to sue each other, but now with the passage of time, exceptions to this general rule have come, allowing even strangers to contract to prosecute. These exceptions are: first is beneficiary under a contract. So now let us understand. If a contract has been entered into between two persons for the benefit of a third person not being a party, then in the event of failure by any party to perform his part, the third party can enforce his right against the other. So the beneficiary can sue upon it, and let us understand this with an example. For example, in a contract between Alex and James, beneficial right in respect of some property may be created in favor of Robin. In that case, Robin can enforce his claim on the basis of his right because the contract has been entered into for his benefit. This concept of a beneficiary in a contract has been highlighted in the cases Muhammad Khan versus Hussaini Begum, very important case law, and this has also been repeated in the previous year question paper. Second, conduct, acknowledgement or admission. Even in this case also, this is also one of the exception of doctrine of privity of contract. There can also be a situation in which, although there may be no privity of contract between the two parties, but if one of them by his conduct or acknowledgement recognizes the right of the other, he may be liable on the basis of law of estoppel. So let us understand with an example. The case law is Narayani Devi versus Tagore Commercial Corporation Limited. For example, if A enters into a contract with B that A will pay rupees 5,000 every month to B during his lifetime and after that to his son C. A also acknowledges his transaction in the presence of C. Now if A defaults, C can sue to him although not being directly a party to a contract. Because C has acknowledged it, so this is the reason why although he is not a party to the contract but still he can sue A. Then provision for maintenance or marriage under family arrangement. This type of provision is treated as an exception to the doctrine of privity of contract for protecting the rights of family members who are not likely to get a specific share and also to give maximum effect to the will of the testator. So let us understand with an example. If A gives his property in equal portions to his three sons with the condition that after his death all three of them will give rupees 10,000 each to C, the daughter of A. Now C can prosecute if any one of them fails to obey this. Because this is actually one of the condition of the testator. Before conveying the property to his three sons, and this is the reason why. And C is the beneficiary, and this is the reason why she can also sue upon those other three sons if they fails to provide her with the maintenance. Then conclusion. From the above discussion, we have seen that although only parties to contract can sue each other and no stranger is allowed to enter between the parties to sue, but with the development of time, the law has also developed and now even a stranger is permitted to sue to safeguard his interest under exceptional circumstances. Then the last question. Write a note on the constitution, jurisdiction and functioning of the International Court of Justice. So let us start with an introduction. The International Court of Justice is the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. It was established in June 1945 by the Charter of the United Nations and began work in April 1946. So this is how ICJ came into force. It was established in June 1945 by the Charter of the United Nations and it began working. That means it came into force or it actually started functioning in April 1946. The seat of the court is at the Peace Place in The Hague, which is situated in Netherlands. Of the 6 principal organs of the United Nations, it is only one not located in New York, United States of America. All the other 5 principal organs are located in New York, but this is the only principal organ which is not located in the United States of America, and it is situated in The Hague, Netherlands. The court's role is to settle in accordance with international law legal disputes submitted to it by states and to give advisory opinions on legal questions referred to it by authorized United Nations organs and specialized agencies. The court is composed of 15 judges who are elected for terms of the office of 9 years by the United Nations General Assembly. Now this is important. So there are total number of 15 judges and their term is 9 years, and they are actually selected by or elected by the United Nations General Assembly and the Security Council. So these two bodies of the UN actually elect the judges of the ICJ. It is assisted by a registry, its administrative organ. Its official languages are English and French. It has 193 state parties and current president is Joan E. Donoghue and vice president is Kirill Gevorgyan. Dalbir Bhandari from India is one of its judges. Then structure. The court is composed of 15 judges who are elected for terms of office of 9 years by the United Nations General Assembly and the Security Council. These organs vote simultaneously but separately. In order to be elected, a candidate must receive an absolute majority of the votes in both the bodies. So for a judge to be elected, it must receive absolute majority in both the bodies of the UN, that means the General Assembly and the Security Council. In order to ensure a measure of continuity, one-third of the court is elected every 3 years and judges are eligible for re-election. So judges are also eligible for re-election and one-third of the judges are actually elected every 3 years. That means there are some judges who are actually retired and they are also eligible for re-election. Then the 15 judges of the court are distributed in following regions: like how they shall be elected. So there are certain quotas, like 3 from Africa, they need to be selected, 2 from Latin America and Caribbean, 3 from Asia, 5 from Western Europe and other states, and 2 from Eastern Europe. Unlike other organs of international organizations, the court is not composed of representatives of governments. Members of the court are independent judges whose first task before taking up their duties is to make a solemn declaration in open court that they will exercise their powers impartially and conscientiously. So this is like the members of the court, I mean the judges are actually they are independent judges, and in order to guarantee his or her independence, no member of the court can be dismissed unless in the unanimous opinion of the other members he or she no longer fulfills the required conditions. So now the question comes, how the judges are actually removed from their office. So they are actually dismissed or removed by the unanimous decision of the other members, that means of the other judges in the same court. This has in fact never happened, but it has never happened. Jurisdiction and functioning. ICJ acts as a world court with twofold jurisdiction. Legal disputes between states submitted to it by them, contentious cases, and requests for advisory opinions on legal questions referred to it by United Nations organs and specialized agencies. So it actually has two jurisdictions. So first, legal dispute which has been submitted by the states, and the other is it has the power to give advisory opinion requested by UN organs and its specialized agencies. All the states which are member of the United Nations and which have become parties to the statute of the court, or which have accepted its jurisdiction under certain conditions, are parties to contentious cases. So who are the, who are the states? So the states are actually the member nations of the UN and who have become parties to the statute of the court or has accepted its jurisdiction. Then states have no permanent representatives accredited to the court. They normally communicate with the registrar through their Minister of Foreign Affairs or their ambassadors accredited to the Netherlands. Then when they are parties to a case before the court, they are represented by an agent. Since international relations are at stake, the agent is also, as it were, the head of a special diplomatic mission with powers to commit a sovereign state. So a case is actually presented by an agent. The judgment is final, binding on the parties to a case and without appeal. And let us now, this is very important. The judgments are actually final and it is actually binding, but it doesn't have any it doesn't confer any power to the aggrieved state to go for appeal. By signing the charter, a member state of the United Nations undertakes to comply with the decision of the court in any case to which it is a party. Then a state which considers that the other side has failed to perform the obligations incumbent upon it under a judgment rendered by the court may bring the matter before the Security Council, which is empowered to recommend or decide upon measures to be taken to give effect to the judgment. Now this is important. Like many of us actually in a confusion that whether the orders of the ICJ is enforceable or not. Well, it is enforceable, and the execution power has been given to the Security Council, and they actually enforce the judgments of the ICJ in case if the state party fails to perform in the obligations given in the judgment. The procedure described above is the normal procedure. However, the course of the proceedings may be modified by incidental proceedings. ICJ discharges its duty as a full court, but at the request of the parties, it may also establish ad hoc members to examine specific cases. Advisory proceedings before the court are only open to 5 organs of the United Nations and 16 specialized agencies of the United Nations family or affiliated organization. So who can go for advisory jurisdiction? 5 organs of the UN and 60 specialized agencies. Opinion provided by the court in advisory proceedings are essentially advisory and not binding. So the advices which are given by the ICJ to its principal organs and specialized agencies are in the nature of advisory and not binding. Then we'll understand the Kulbhushan Jadhav case. Kulbhushan Jadhav was arrested in March 2016 by Pakistani security forces in Balochistan province after he reportedly entered from Iran. He was sentenced to death by a Pakistani military court on the charges of espionage and terrorism in April 2017. India has always maintained that Kulbhushan Jadhav is not a spy and that Pakistan should provide consular access to him as it pertains to abduction from the Iranian territory. So I hope you understand. So Kulbhushan Jadhav was actually an Indian resident, and he was arrested by the Pakistan military for the charges of espionage, and he was arrested from Iran. And India has actually challenged his death sentence given by the Pakistani military court, as he was not provided the consular access, which is his right under Vienna Convention on Consular Relations. Now we'll see. In May 9, 2018, ICJ has stayed his death sentence after India had moved a petition before the UN body to seek justice for him, alleging violation of the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations by Pakistan. So his death sentence has actually been stayed by the ICJ. During the latest hearing in the case on February 2019, India said Pakistan's continued custody of Indian national Kulbhushan Jadhav without any consular access should be declared unlawful, as it was an egregious violation of the Vienna Convention. Harish Salve, who is representing India and Kulbhushan Jadhav in the ICJ, said Pakistan was using the issue of Kulbhushan Jadhav as a propaganda tool without even knowing the due proper procedure. So now you must have understood, like, the state is actually represented by an agent, and they are not called lawyers as the word used in Indian courts. Now we'll come to conclusion. ICJ suffers from certain limitation. It has no jurisdiction to try individuals accused of war crimes or crimes against humanity. So ICJ doesn't have any jurisdiction over these crimes, as it is not a criminal court. It doesn't have a prosecutor able to initiate proceedings. The jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice is general and thereby differs from that of specialized international tribunals such as International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. So ICJ is not a specialized court. The court is not a Supreme Court to which national courts can turn. It doesn't act as a court of last resort for individuals, nor is it an appeal court for any international tribunal. It can, however, rule on the validity of arbitral awards. So these are the certain limitations of the ICJ. It doesn't have the appellatory power, and also it is not a specialized court, and there are other and it is also not a court of last resort for individuals. So this is the reason why ICJ suffers some infirmities. The court can only hear a dispute when requested to do so by one or more states. It cannot deal with a dispute on its own initiative. Neither is it permitted under its statute to investigate and rule on acts of sovereign states as it chooses. So the court also doesn't have the power of investigation. The ICJ only has jurisdiction based on consent and not compulsory jurisdiction. So only the consensual states can go for the jurisdiction in ICJ, and it is not a compulsory jurisdiction. It doesn't enjoy a full separation of powers, with permanent members of the Security Council being able to veto enforcement of cases, even those to which they consented to be bound. So this is our session for today, and I hope you all have liked it. Do not forget to give a like, share and subscribe to the channel. I will be discussing with you the subjective this solution of the subjective questions of ILI CAT in all the coming sessions. So stay tuned to my channel, keep watching and have a nice day.